Welcome back to the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin, talking as always with Bobby Mixa in Poland. Bobby, how are you?
I'm good, Andrew. How are you? I heard it's cold in Texas.
It's much too cold for me in Texas, but it will soon pass, and then we'll get back to the heat. I hope eventually. I don't like winter very much.
Yeah. Well,
So
come to Poland in the summer. So,
yeah, we're looking forward to that for sure. But we're also looking forward to this conversation that we have in front of us today. We're really delighted to welcome Dr. Michael Hanby, who is Associate Professor of Religion and Philosophy of Science at the John Paul II Institute in Washington, D.C. And I have so many thoughts about where we might go with this conversation. So really looking forward to it. Professor Hanby, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. It's good to be here and good to see you again, Bobby.
yeah, likewise. It's been a couple of years. So, always eager to talk to you and always looking for your latest article. So,
Yeah, before we started recording, the three of us were just chit-chatting about how when Bobby and I used to work together at Word on Fire, I admit about 4 years ago or so, Dr. Hamby, I didn't know your work, but Bobby began to tell me about you. And actually, the first thing he said was, I had this professor at the JP2 Institute who's a former Anglican like you. So you and I have that in
Hmm.
common, I think, Dr. Hamby. But the thing that I just have really latched onto in your work, and I know Bobby too, is the way that you talk about technology. And I know that you write about so many different things, but something that really is beginning to occur to me and maybe even weigh on me is that now, of course, there's a group of people who are all in on technology and they believe that's the future of humanity and whatever. But then there's sort of a lot of other people who are kind of okay with it, but kind of reticent about it. And they have a whole kind of throat clearing exercise that they do where they say, well, now, of course, we're grateful for this. And now, of course, we're grateful for that. But what are we going to do about these sort of outlying problems related to technology, right? Now, in your work, I have really felt um, a kind of kindred spirit in your perspective, which is to say, the problem is a whole lot bigger, really, than these kind of quasi apologists for technology would admit. So maybe I'll just throw it to you from there. And Bobby, I know you want to jump in too, but what do you say to people who, just in casual conversation? I know you write for a popular audience and for a scholarly audience. What do you say to people who are just going through their kind of ho-hum lives trying to make sense of technology?
Well, I do have my own version of that apologetics, that throat clearing that you described. It's almost required, right? I mean, to raise fundamental or deeply critical questions about technology or science is um, I think, as Wendell Berry said, sort of scratch the surface of a kind of fundamentalism, oftentimes. That and the fact that insofar as the point is not to issue some kind of moralistic denunciation of technology, but to understand it. I mean, what is required, I think, in honesty, to acknowledge. I mean, technology is almost magic. The powers that it's placed into our hands are wonderful in the old sense, and that it elicits amazement or wonder, um, and it is so thoroughly and deeply intertwined with our lives. We are so utterly dependent upon it. Our access to reality is so thoroughly mediated by it that it would not only be churlish but almost kind of unmeaning to denounce it in that way, because it has become a kind of second nature for us, or what I sometimes call a regime of necessity for us. And insofar as we are tool making and tool using animals, insofar as that it lies very close to the bone of what it means to be to live in the image of God. Um, the fusion of technology or of nature and artifice lies very close to the human condition. So for all of those reasons, I think it's necessary at times to hedge what one has to say or to offer those kinds of qualifications or that kind of apology, or at least that kind of clarification about what I am and am not saying. And yet, those very same things are why it's so deeply problematic, right? Because we are so utterly dependent upon it, because it is a regime of necessity, because it does, in ways both obvious and hidden, um, shape our perception of reality, mediate our access to reality. And it's why that kind of denunciation or that kind of affirmation of, the idea that technology is just this sort of collection of devices and instruments outside of us that are indifferent in themselves and can be used in morally licit and or morally illicit ways, while not false, is really not adequate to grasp what technology is for us, what it means for us, its power over us. And so, really, my work in this area is just an attempt, insofar as it is within my powers, to try and understand as deeply and comprehensively as possible what it means to live with and in the midst of all of this.
Fascinating, fascinating. When you talk about technology, I always remember you made a distinction, like what you just did with the devices out there, but then technology, technologia, a way of understanding. And so, could you maybe say a couple words about this, maybe narrowing, perhaps, or maybe even a novel way of thinking about reason? Because I know you do a lot of work too on early modernity. And instead of just reducing things to like, okay, this is all this kind of praxis and Marxism, the 20th century, 19th century, you go all the way back to people like Francis Bacon to say that, hey, this has been with us for a long time. And it's not just something from Europe that has been imported to America, that is somehow like polluted the stream here, but yet it somehow is this new thing that finds in a way its origins perhaps in this new thing called America. And so it's just interesting too, because I've been reading a lot too about like people like Nietzsche, who read a lot of Emerson, and then Emerson's whole thing. And so you have this kind of, I'm bringing in a lot here, but you have people saying, oh, it's from Europe, but then the very people who they're blaming as are reading the Americans, they're now discovering. And so it's just the early modernity seems to be such an important time for this new thing.
It's such a fascinating historical period, and the thought that issues from that period is so uh, revolutionary and so powerful in its historical effect and how has shaped our world, and what some call the kind of the social imaginary, or Charles Taylor's immanent frame, the way that uh, uh, you know we in frame our understanding of reality, and the way that shapes what we can and can't think about. Um, there's a lot in what you said. I'll try and I don't know if I'll even remember it all, but let me deal with some of the aspects that most jumped out at me. I mean, first of all, you made reference to the peculiar and peculiarly modern word that fuses, techne and logos, knowing and making. And what that signifies, you're absolutely right, is a revolutionary reconception in early modern thought. And Francis Bacon, you're right, does typify this, probably better than anyone. Um, a radical reconception of both reason itself and what reason always strives for, namely truth. And whereas the entire Western Greek and Christian tradition, or the predominant one, had always subordinated the practical and the mechanical, the practical reason and the mechanical arts to theoretical and contemplative reason, the one aiming for either the good in the moral sense, or what can be produced in the creative sense of making. All of this was subordinate to and served ultimately um, the attempt to discover truth in the sense of an order that precedes us, the kind of eternal, and an order that precedes us that reflects the eternal divine wisdom, right? So that the idea that to enter into to contemplation was to touch what doesn't change, and to discover something of the eternal order and structure of things. The fusion of techne and logos, knowing and making, is ultimately the rendering of that older sense of reason obsolete. Um, and the replacement of it, and it's funny you mentioned Francis Bacon. I mean, Francis Bacon is quite self-conscious of the fact that he's doing this, that he's offering a new conception of reason that has to be evaluated not on the terms of the old conception of reason, but on its own terms. Um, and this new conception of reason would fuse knowing and making, techne and logos, um, and be judged in its truth by success in producing um, new inventions, new products, manipulating nature according to a preset plan, isolating causes and effects in experimental fashion. And so, in a certain sense, technology is both a new, in its deepest sense, is a new, and by new I mean 500 years old now, a new conception of reason that measures its veracity in terms of its success in conquering, manipulating, predicting nature, and on that basis, generating um, what we more commonly think of as technology, new tools and instruments which further the purpose of commanding and controlling nature and bettering um, our states. And so, there's the old saying that nothing succeeds like success. When success becomes the measure of truth, the older questions, which may or may not give you practical success in such matters, kind of fall by the wayside and become obsolete. And the result is that this new conception of reason that is inherently technological in this deeper sense comes to define what it means for us to think, to exclude from our ways of thinking and speaking and apprehending the world the older understanding, and really, therefore, determining what it is that we as moderns see and think about, and what our society is collectively preoccupied with, which tends to be progress, scientific and technological progress itself. So I've often said and you mentioned America. What's peculiar about uh, the American experiment, and it's interesting that we describe our collective life in these terms, right, as an experiment, right? What is peculiar about it, I think, is that it's predominantly and originally the work, though it's been infused from a lot of different streams in the century since. Predominantly and originally the work of English-speaking Protestants, right, who did not bring these older Greek and Catholic traditions across the sea with them. And that really bears no memory, certainly no positive memory of them, such that our sort of organizing, the sort of organizing logic of our culture is arguably rooted in this modern foundation. It's why I often say that North America, the United States, tends to be essentially modern in a way that European modernity is not, and that to that extent, this collective conquest of nature, pursued across generations, has really been our collective purpose insofar as we have one. And so, in a scholarly setting, I'll sometimes make the kind of provocative suggestion upsetting to the guild of political theorists that if there's a kind of organizing, oh, sorry, I don't know if you can hear my email beeping in, but I should figure out a way to close that down. Um, that if there is a sort of or text that depicts what it was that America essentially is and would become. It's not what our political theorists and what we in our sort of national piety tend to think. It's not necessarily the Federalist Papers or Locke's Second Treatise of Government or the writings of Jefferson, although they quite interestingly evince what I'm about to say, or even more ominously Hobbes' Leviathan. It's something more like Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, which depicts a kind of scientific and technological utopia. It depicts a society that is collectively bent on mastering the energy of natures and has elevated that to the status of something like a religion. Um, there and anachronistically, there are a lot of sort of 16th century peculiarities to that text, but in that sense, in that essential sense, it's a pretty good description of what we are, I think.
That's fascinating. Just as an aside, before pursuing this a little bit further, the whole question of kind of the success of technology is something that I find really amusing at times. Like you hear people say, we're working on a cure for this cancer or like whatever. But then when you pause and step back at the big picture, you think, well, okay, that's a success in a way, but that cancer didn't exist 150 years ago. None of them did, right? So it's like sort of our success is based on sort of moving forward to solve problems that our technology has created, in a sense. At least that's, I don't know, my perspective on some of this, but.
Well, I don't want to attribute every cancer to some prior technological intervention on our behalf, but the general observation that you're making, I think, is absolutely right, and I think it points to something essential about modern technology in particular. I mean, certainly, probably inherent in human making as such, but Bobby will know this, and you probably do as well, that I've been deeply influenced by Jewish philosopher Hans Jonas, who makes the observation, and I think he's certainly right about this, that while this might be inherent in human making as such, the capacity of ancient humanity to probe deeply into nature, or to expand its power far beyond a human scale, was relatively limited, right? And therefore, while there might always be unanticipated consequences to human action, ways that we affect the shape of future human civilization through the things that we make and build. I mean, you can think about the downstream consequence of the Roman Empire uniting the Eastern Mediterranean through an unprecedented system of roads, for example. While that may be true, there's something peculiar about modern technology in the range of objects it presides over, the depth at which we are able to penetrate into the inner workings of nature, and consequently the consequences that ensue from these interventions. And the result is that we can't anticipate. Is that the effects of our deeds typically elude our control, right? And we can't anticipate all the downstream consequences of our interventions, especially as these increasingly pertain to our intervention into our own nature. Right? If you make a heritable modification to human nature, you have immediately, precisely because of the way it historically propagates, you immediately lost control of your ability to contain the consequences or whatever defects you may have introduced. So, Jonas has this great line that you can't recall scrap populations, and I think that points to something really essential about the powers that we have accumulated to ourselves, namely that we're not really in control of them. we're not really, we cannot really foresee, anticipate, prevent the downstream consequences. And as a consequence, therefore, we're oftentimes, as in your example, um, find ourselves confronted with a state of perpetual emergency, coping with the effects of our previous deeds. So, I don't know where you guys stand on anthropogenic climate change, for example. But this would be one instance, right? No, at the outset of the Industrial Revolution, no one anticipated that we might have it within our power to fundamentally alter the basic ecological health of our planet and the shape of our weather. To the extent that that's true, it would be a perfect example of this phenomenon. Or we're discovering. It's interesting the studies that have come out just in the last couple of weeks about um, the microplastics that we are apparently ingesting with every meal and every sip of water. Right? Such that it's now not clear or not obvious that we can actually avoid. I mean, I don't know. I haven't studied these things closely, and I don't know how much alarmism. I'm not pronouncing on the veracity of these reports and the stories, and I don't know what they mean. But they at least introduce the possibility that we have poisoned ourselves or are in the process of poisoning ourselves in a way that exceeds our capacity to correct.
Right. And we hate to despair. Of course, we're not people of despair. We won't despair. But at the same time, when we hear people talk about solutions, it almost sounds moot to some degree. I mean, you in an essay that Bobby and I were just talking about that you wrote for First Things in 2016 called "A More Perfect Absolutism," which is an article I share with people. I think it's just a really wonderful piece. You say technology, yeah, it's just terrific, and you make so many good points in there that I think you make, in other places too. But you say in there, technology does not wait on politics. Even the state cannot finally contain the forces it unleashes. So whenever you have someone, and it could be, Greta Thunberg, the environmental activist, or it could be, somebody else on the complete other side, it's almost as if no matter what your side, when you're standing up saying, we've got to do something about this and we've got to use politics to kind of, to pass laws and redirect or, whatever this may be. It's not to say nothing can ever be done, but it is kind of naive in a way, isn't it?
It sure seems to be. Sure seems to be. And particularly insofar as our attempts to quote unquote address the problems um, are thought through with this in the same manner of reasoning that produced them.
Right.
Right. I mean, the idea that there is and must always be and can really only ever be um, uh, technological solutions to fundamentally human problems. It seems to me is to attempt to treat the sickness with more of the disease. Now, that's not to say that the application of technologies for cleaning up an environmental mess produced by our technologies isn't something that we should seek or strive for. It's not to say that to reject that to core would be to refuse medicine or something, which of course none of us realistically has any interest in doing. But it is to say that if there is to be a quote unquote solution, it probably involves trying to recover um, uh, some of what this technological civilization and its dynamisms have suppressed, namely, more fundamentally, untechnological or atechnological, as it were, and human ways of living and above all thinking. I'm a big proponent in the absence of an obvious technological solution to the problems that technological society has generated. I'm a big proponent of understanding and of recovering the value of philosophy and recovering the value of thinking and understanding for its own sake, both as a way to more deeply penetrate the real meaning of some of these problems, but also uh, as a different form of living, I guess you might say.
Kind of on that note, I've been thinking a lot, like if this is the kind of world that we've been swimming in, just, taking it in like, fish in water, not even realizing that we're in this.
And not
What's
realizing that with that water, we're ingesting all these microplastics.
Yeah, but like, but as Catholics, you think, okay, like I go around Krakow and I'm taking pictures of the place all the time. And then I'm posting it up for people to see. And I just constantly think, oh my gosh, I'm using this place as it's like a standing reserve of some kind of like thing for me to then put up online. And then I'm often thinking when I'm doing this, okay, the essay concerning technology by Heidegger oftentimes comes up. And I'm like, okay, well, how am I doing this in some ways in other respects? To even my way of approaching the faith, the church. And instead of kind of like, and I'm thinking about this in terms of the city of Krakow, instead of just like inhabiting the place, truly living in this, the city and being a member of the city, in some ways, while I'm taking pictures, I'm still kind of at a remove from it, using it still. But I'm oftentimes thinking, well, how does this like technological way of thinking inform like the way we see even things like the tradition, or even seeing, when people become Catholic, how do they view that? Is it to now become like, okay, I'm going to become somehow a content creator or something else and that will be my vocation. And I know I'm bringing a lot of things in here, but the way that what you're pinpointing about this kind of techno logos. How have you seen this actually informing our way of perceiving the faith?
Oh man, that is a vast question that seems to me to have like it probably has layer upon layer upon you know upon layer. Let me try and attack a few of them. I mean, the first thing, and some of the things that I've written about the state of the church, for lack of a better way of putting it, and the various talk that we've seen bandied about uh, paradigm shifts within the church, for example. Um, it seemed to me can be understood in part in terms of the broad movement that I've described. That, in other words, the loss of the value of contemplation, the loss of the value of uh, philosophical thinking, the replacement of contemplative and philosophical forms of thought, and a traditional conception of truth by what we have broadly considered, a technological one, a functional and practical one. This isn't a phenomenon that is outside of us and outside of the church. And there is a real danger uh, at, I think, the highest levels, in fact, that of succumbing, as it were, more completely and unwittingly, actually, um, to this pragmatic and technological spirit under the guise of pastoralism, for example. So there's that, right? And this particular podcast, this particular discussion, isn't about the state of the church and current events and the controversies and divisions. So I don't want to go too far in that direction. I'll just point out that those aren't unrelated to what we're talking about. Um, on the other hand, you're absolutely right. I mean, you point to something more, I suppose, empirical, one might say, which is the way that uh, technology has so and social media have so colonized the public square. If it does, if a tree falls in the forest and Twitter doesn't hear it, does it make a sound? Right? If you're not engaged, if you don't participate in the world in a way that is mediated by social media, do you belong to it at all? Right? I mean, the question about I've said and written this before. The question of whether to tweet or not to tweet, or to be present in these media is no longer just a question about uh, whether to avail yourself of some particular media or technological instrument. It's really a question about whether to be visible as a participant in the public square, because this is where the public square now is. That exerts an enormous pressure upon people. I mean, insofar as I, publish in media that are, available online, I'm not exempt from this pressure either. Though each of us has to ask ourselves, about the extent to which we're going to be involved in it. Creates an enormous pressure to be visible, to be present, to adjudicate these issues via these media, which I think Marshall McLuhan is exactly right in recognizing that the media itself shape the content and the quality of our thought. And so I think there's a lot of interesting thought to be done. A number of people, including many who I fundamentally disagree with about almost everything, with respect to what it means to be Catholic, have also pointed this out. And, the way in which our ecclesial life and our arguments about fundamentally what it means to be Catholic are distorted and have been distorted by the omnipresence of this media these media in our lives, and the way that this is our common meeting point. Um, and I don't quite know, how to think about or what to do about that. It seems to me that it's certainly a factor that has to be taken into account. It's also a factor that, rightly or wrongly, has rendered certain, pieties about the role of the laity relative to the hierarchy obsolete, at least empirically speaking. And I don't think it has helped the cause of Christian unity. That's for sure.
Dr. Hamby, there's a pair of images that somebody put together a few years ago. One of them was the picture outside there in St. Peter's Square right before Pope Benedict XVI was about to come out onto the balcony. And the other one was the same scene right before Pope Francis was about to come out onto the balcony. Now Pope Francis, that was 10 years ago now. I mean, even that was a long time ago. But the first image of Pope Benedict, everybody was just standing in the square. There was maybe a random camera here or there, whatever. In 2013, when Pope Francis became Pope, every single person in the square was holding up a phone, every single one of them. So just in that sort of few years transition, the church, the faithful, everybody sort of fundamentally changed the way they were perceiving and sort of living in reality. And, just to connect this to some of the points that we were making earlier, and then I love your thoughts on that. It seems to me that the problem is, right, and you point this out, that technology or technocracy or whatever it is, it's a totalizing vision. Like we don't even know, like we talked about before, swimming in the water. We don't even know that we're being coerced. Like it's just is the way it is. And the church, although we don't want to talk in terms of like coercion, but the church too is supposed to be a totalizing vision. So I mean, it seems like for the church to be in the world in its current setup is very, very complicated, such that like even at the highest levels of the church, it's basically kind of just another type of technocracy, right?
I mean, I'm reluctant to say that. I mean, certainly not in essence. But now I want to be careful also. in
Yeah,
in
sorry
in,
for leading you down the wrong path. Yeah,
in this field.
yeah,
Um,
go ahead.
let me put it this way. We are no longer I mean, a lot of disgruntled people have often pointed out this fact that in the 13th century, for example, just to draw a century out of a hat, it was quite possible for the average Catholic to live the majority of his life with little, having never seen a pope, um, with little or no knowledge as to to who a pope is, to what a pope might say or teach at any given instance, right? That's obviously changed for a great many historical reasons, over the course of the last 2 or 3 centuries. Um, but it is arguably changed to such an extent um, that the church now communicates wittingly or unwittingly, right? Um, in, intentionally or unintentionally, not only through what it says or through what it promulgates, um, but by the images that it presents of itself through these media, oftentimes without ever saying anything whatsoever, in ways that um, it's naive to ignore, right? And it does this, and so you think about, uh, for example, and again, I don't want to venture too far into a thicket. Um, but you think about the response to Fiducia Supplicans, right? And the image, the effect that created by the promulgation of that document, the way that it was taken up into the media, the consequences of that within the culture. I mean, I think about, famously or notoriously, as you might have it, the fact that within um, uh, uh, 2 or 3 hours of the promulgation of that document, you had Father Martin appearing on the front page of the New York Times in a photo opportunity, and the various messages that are communicated without saying anything by virtue of the photo opportunities of Father Martin with the Pope. Without evaluating, I bring these things to light, not to, to comment upon their content per se, so much as to point out that we have here something unprecedented, a technologically or media driven dynamic um, that is in which it's possible to produce, or inevitable that one will produce and will generate through this media environment, effects that are quite um, uh, other than what anyone might say. So this is no longer a phenomenon or a dynamic that we can ignore, because this is what it is to be a church that is visible by means of these media. And it's not clear to me that we know, or that we have categories, really, theological categories, for thinking about that phenomenon yet. I was just reading for a class that I was teaching. In a class that I just finished this morning. We were reading some excerpts from Luther, and in preparation for this, I was reading some of the prefatory documents announcing each session of the doctrine of the Council of Trent. And each one concludes with an instruction for how these instructions are going to be sort of nailed to the door of the Church of the Lateran and promulgated for X amount of time, prior to the convocation of the meetings and so forth. that's not the world that we live in anymore, right? Where the church just issues a declaration and everyone reads it and responds accordingly. We now communicate by deed and by image as well as by uh, uh, proclamation. And that can be by design, but that's also, and that can be well used or manipulated by design, but it's also just an inevitable consequence of the kind of technological and media environment in which we live. And we've got to reckon with this in certain ways. I know Larry Chapp has been doing some thinking and some writing about this. It seems like we may have drifted a long way from Bobby's original question, but it's just to say that just in the same way that that technology that the question of technology can be posed at in and of itself at a variety of different levels and in a variety of different ways, that it concerns both the sort of empirical instruments at our disposal and this new kind of philosophical way of apprehending the world. So too, your question about technology and the faith, it seems to me, can be posed at similar levels and relates or is pertinent to all of them.
Well, it just seems to me that I mean, thinking about this a lot lately because I'm teaching a lot of 20th century history, and it seems to me that in 20th century it's nothing but power in terms of and just the various dynamics of it. I mean, if you want to talk about the century of Karl Marx and going with him or reacting to him, it's the 20th century, it seems to me. And I just finished up going over all the various political parties in South Africa. And the kids are only learning about strategy and tactics as the textbook presents it. And it seemed to me, I gave them, because I was reading your essay, I gave them a little bit about, okay, well, let's think about this. Is everything then at the end of the day reduced to politics or just force? And, for some of the students, the light bulb went off. And I'm like, well, what are you studying for? I mean, I'm always asking these questions, and then ultimately it's to like, what are you for? What's this whole dang thing for? Like the whole cosmos. And so inevitably, that way of thinking is totally foreign to them. But yet the kind of like the all the various like the tactics, that makes sense. But I was just thinking, well, I'm so tired of reading the news, especially the Catholic news lately, because it just seems to me that we're so stuck in that way of perceiving the faith. It's just it seems to me like the question of truth oftentimes is like it's important, but the real issue is the kind of power politics and all of that. So I don't know. It just seems to me that we've all drink from this well, and there's a real need to because even things like you think about like adoration and all this other stuff that would free you perhaps from that, or just thinking about okay, we're meant to pray and it's about like worshiping God. That stuff then gets thrown into this political fight.
Yeah, I mean, I concur completely, and it's another manifestation of, I think, I mean, I should give you the antecedent here. The politicization of everything, right? Uh, is in a certain sense the political form of the same phenomenon that we're talking about in the technological sphere. I mean, and what ultimately is at the root of it is the loss of the eternal, right? The law and the loss of the eternal and the equation, the reduction, whether explicit or inadvertent, of truth to power or function or effect, the dominance of pragmatic thinking, in other words, you might say. Uh, and the remarkable thing about that, and I think you hinted at this, Bobby, is that we don't even see it. You know, I've kind of I have this line that I've used in a number of things that I've written. You probably, and maybe even in the 2016 article that you were um, uh, mentioning earlier, Andrew, that how remarkable it is that there's no such thing as a profound question in American life. And I remember how struck I was when that occurred to me. You know that there are questions of deep import, right? Questions about the very nature of things, about that we're incapable even really of posing. And not only that, we're not troubled by that incapacity. We don't notice its absence. We adjudicate those questions all the time. But we adjudicate them in other forms, you know, as questions of what we can do through, you know, biomedical technology, or questions of adjudicating our competing rights claims in the political sphere. Um, and it's our incapacity to ask what is true, or to think about what is true in principle with respect to God or human nature. And again, there are both secular and ecclesiastical forms of this problem, I think. The replacement of philosophy by sociology or psychology, or, you know, other functional forms of reason in the church. Um, it's remarkable to me what a loss that, at one at the same time, what a loss that betokens, um, and yet how we seem not to recognize or know what we're missing. I'm not sure that was apropos of anything, but
No,
it attempts to sort of comment on the um, on your observation, which I think is spot on. You know, and the various ways in which um, you know, power rules our lives.
I think it is important that you brought that up, because you know, one of the issues that we've kind of bounced around without necessarily taking a strong stand is, you know, there's this ongoing question, certainly among kind of the Catholic intelligentsia, but beyond as well, about kind of this whole like liberalism, post-liberalism, kind of that kind of question. And I guess the question that I have for you on that front is this kind of all politicized reality a natural byproduct of liberalism, or is it, what is it? I mean, do we sort of know the pedigree, and are we concerned about, you know, finding some alternative of some reality, some way of organizing ourselves in the future that would mitigate that a little bit?
You guys don't ask small questions, do
I
you?
know. I'm sorry.
No. It's a great question. It just, you know, it probably, to answer it satisfactorily, probably, you know, requires much more than I can give you in this space, or maybe that's even at my disposal. What I think I would say um, is that liberalism is the political form, you know, of a an understanding of reality that is already dispensed with eternity and already adopted this kind of technological form of reasoning. So, you know, it's not an accident that modern science and technology and liberal political order emerge side by side and grow up together, and are oftentimes the product of the very same thinkers. I mean, you know, Hobbes, Locke, Bacon, Thomas Jefferson, for that matter. They are simultaneously sort of natural philosophers adopting this view of nature and of reason, and political theorists. And I don't think that's accidental. And so I forget exactly how you phrased the question, but it seems to me that it's not just that liberal political order produces this kind of pragmatic form of reasoning as its predominant mode. and thereby excludes uh, uh, questions about the true nature of things from um, its understanding of reason and really from the world. It's not just that liberalism produces this; it also presupposes the understanding of God, nature, knowledge, and truth that makes that inevitable.
Hmm.
So I think certainly the significance of liberal political order in helping to give birth to something like a new Atlantis and its characteristic forms of life and thought is not to be minimized. But I wouldn't want to absolutize it either, because underneath liberalism are other judgments of a fundamentally philosophical and theological character that are in some ways more basic than the politics itself.
And kind of
Is
going
that an
on.
answer to your question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think you're so, if not to flatter you, but you're such a scholar that I think, these big questions, you want to answer them in big ways, but I love the way that you're able to just boil them down for us because
Well, I
that's
hope
very
I'm boiling it
meaningful.
down. I mean, I hope
Mm.
that makes some sense. If not, I apologize.
No, very much so.
But this connection, disconnecting from like eternity, or not having eternity be kind of seen as like the connected to the temporal. Um, I was thinking, I think it was on Chap's podcast. You mentioned two thinkers who you think are like really important today, like Charles Péguy and Maurice Blondel. And Péguy has, I think it's in English titled "The Temporal" or "The Eternal and the Temporal." And I've been thinking, Andrew and I, we like kind of as a patron for this new project, we decided, because I was thinking about pilgrimage all the time and hope, and Péguy just kept, and I learned about Péguy at the John Paul II Institute.
Yeah.
Um, but I just kept thinking about Péguy, and he dies right at the beginning, or right World War I, when it seems like the European order comes, falling apart. And it just seems like he's posing all of these questions and seeing at the heart of the kind of a lot of the things that, we're now, identifying during this podcast. But do you have anything to say about Péguy? Like, why did you say that Péguy is so important, including like, maybe if we don't have time, but like Maurice Blondel as well?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, just at so many levels, I love Piggy. I mean, his Portal of the Mystery of Hope. Um, I often tell, uh, my students that that's how I want to exit the earth. If I get to choose my own deathbed scene, it will be with someone reading Peggy to me on my way out. It's so beautiful and so profound, and I'm never not affected by it. But in this particular instance, I'm thinking particularly of that little collection that in English titled "The Temporal and the Eternal," and it just seems to me um, that Peggy, in a profound way, sees into the heart of what he calls the mystical or the metaphysical disaster of the modern age in a profound and unsparing way, and he rightly, in a certain sense, attributes it. I mean, it is the project of a failed Christendom in a certain sense. And so one cannot, I mean, at one and the same time in reading Peggy, one rediscovers, I think, the grounds of profound hope while not falling into any kind of error of triumphalism about, Christian responsibility for the mess that we're in. Um, but the mess, as he describes it, is not is. I mean, I think he perceived quite early and quite deeply um, the post-Christian and therefore not merely bad Christian character of the modern world, the depths to which it amounts to a rejection of what he calls, the whole Christian system. right? It just an overcoming it and setting aside, and ultimately, in a certain sense, it is the essence of that rejection is a kind of disincarnation, insofar as it represents the sundering of the temporal from the eternal, right? And Blondel. One of the reasons I find Blondel, well, I find Péguy really helpful for coming to grips with the depths of the catastrophe that we're living in without losing hope. And I find Blondel particularly helpful, and I'm thinking here particularly of of History and Dogma, for example. Blondel to be particularly helpful in that he's writing about he has a really kind of like Péguy deep appreciation of the real meaning of the modernist crisis and the inadequacy of the church's initial attempt to respond to it and address it. And insofar as what we are experiencing now is a kind of degraded reliving of relitigation of that crisis, right? With the church increasingly divided between a kind of recalcitrant traditionalism, the eternal without the temporal, so to speak, or the eternal that remains kind of extrinsically related to it. One form of extrinsicism, juxtaposed to a kind of modernism that represents another form of extrinsicism, a kind of extrinsicism from below. History is this sort of immanent theater of power relations that has to be negotiated horizontally. It seems to me that both thinkers taken together just cast a really searing light maybe on the moment that we're living in now. So I would, I just encourage a kind of patient and careful reading of them in light of the divisions that are currently afflicting us within the church, certainly, but also the way those divisions within the church reflect the deeper metaphysical, or what Péguy calls the mystical crisis that of modernity more generally. I feel like I'm retreating to higher and higher planes of abstraction in trying to answer your questions. I hope again that makes some sense.
Absolutely,
it does. That leaves us with hope, to be sure. And on that note, Dr. Michael Hanby, we will encourage our audience to read some Péguy, some Blondel, some Hanby, just to read. I think that's a great way to try to find a way, to get some metaphysics back into reality. For those who are watching or listening via audio-only podcast, we encourage you to rate us, to share us, and to let us know what you think about these conversations that we're having. We're having a great time with this project at the Space Alby Institute. Check us out, spacealbyinstitute.com. For now, thank you, Dr. Michael Hanby, for joining us.
Thank you both so much. It was really a pleasure to talk to you. I enjoyed it tremendously.
Until next time, God bless and live